Major funding for a walk through Central Park is provided by the Marsh and McLennan Companies.
Each year, 275 species of birds are drawn to the green heart of New York. Many are just passing through. Others build families. At MMC, we love that New York is a part of so many different lives. After all, our instincts brought us here too. Marsh and McLennan Company.
One word that describes New York City is the word energy. And there is no more energy in this great city, New York, than right here, Midtown Manhattan, 59th Street and 5th Avenue. This is our next walking tour, but this walking tour is not about the buildings and the concrete and the bridges and how the city got this way. This walking tour is about 843 magnificent acres that we call Central Park. I'm David Hartman. Our historian is Barry Lewis. And Barry, this thing just didn't erupt like a volcano.
You're absolutely right about that. Central Park was built to make this city civilized.
Ooh.
Oh, yes. You know, back in 1800, this was a mellow place. It was a tiny town at the very bottom of Manhattan Island, a very homogeneous population, beautiful bucolic setting. By the 1840s, it's a completely different place. It's a teeming metropolis. We were the largest city in the country by far. We were the financial capital. We had a huge, growing, and prosperous middle class, but there was a downside.
What?
Oh, the pollution was terrible. The traffic jams were horrible. The sidewalks in the commercial part of town jammed, people in your face, and we had a whole new population of very poor immigrants pouring in, Irish and German. In the 1840s, you have several spokespeople who come out for a park, among them Horace Greeley and William Cullen Bryant, and in those days, journalists had the power that Hollywood people have today.
Right.
But the greatest proponent of this park was A.J. Downing. Andrew Jackson Downing, who came from the Hudson River Valley. He was America's first ecologist before that word ever existed. He was our first landscape architect before that word ever existed. He was the first American to really understand, to ask himself about the relationship between the built environment and the natural environment. He brought in as a partner an English-born and trained architect by the name of Calvin Vaux. Mr. Vaux came over in 1850 and immediately became part of Downing's professional life, including Downing's call for a Central Park. So Vaux was here at the very beginning of the story of Central Park.
And we're talking 1850s.
The 1840s and 50s, you're right. Now, by the early 1850s, the city agrees with Downing, and they offer an area on the East River for a new park. It was called Jones's Wood. Now remember, in the 1850s, the city hardly extended past 42nd Street, but they knew already by the end of the 19th century it would cover all of Manhattan Island. But Downing understood this was going to be a great metropolis one day. That 175-acre tract was too small. So the city...
What vision.
Oh, he was a brilliant man, Downing. So the city offered a second site in the center of the island.
But they already had a little bit of it, right?
Well, they already had the Croton Reservoir. They owned that, and they were soon going to build a second reservoir to the north of that. But this tract would go from 59th to 106th Street. Later on, they extended it to 110th. It was far larger. It was over 800 acres, if you count the 110th Street. But it was cheap, it was available, and it gave us the size of a park that we needed. Back in 1800, the city opened up to the rivers. The rivers were our recreation. By 1840, they were lined with factories. They were polluted.
So there was no place to get away from the pollution.
And the city turned inward. And isn't it interesting, where does Central Park go? But in the center of the island, New Yorkers flocked into it. And once they completed it, every city across the United States had to have its own version of Central Park. This park taught Americans not only how to build their cities, but how to live in them.
We're on the roof garden of the Arsenal, which is one of only 2 buildings in Central Park today that predate the actual building of the park. All right, the decision was made to build the park, 1850s. Who did what then?
Well, in 1857, the city decided to get serious about building this park. They hired both a chief engineer to clear the land and a superintendent to supervise the laborers to clear that land.
And who were they?
Well, the engineer was Egbert Ville. The supervisor, the superintendent, was Frederick Law Olmsted.
Coming together.
More of him in a moment. Egbert Ville was a brilliant topographical engineer. As a matter of fact, in the next decade, in 1865, he drew up a topographical map of Manhattan Island that shows every stream, every marshland, the original contours of the island. This is so accurate that builders and contractors today still use it to make sure underneath their property they're not going to be surprised. Yes, absolutely. Commissioners also asked Ville to draw up a plan for the park. He was not as brilliant in drawing up a park plan as he was in topographical maps. And the commissioners realized that, but the guy who really got angry about the mediocrity of Ville's plan was Calvert Vaux. Now, Downing had died in 1852 in a tragic accident at the age of 37. Vaux felt it's up to him to continue Downing's work.
So what did he do?
So he got the commissioners to basically throw out Ville's plan and hold a competition. And Vaux intended to enter that competition, but he knew he couldn't do it on his own. So he pulls in the one man he thought could help him, and that was Frederick Law Olmsted. No wonder they chose Olmsted and Vaux's plan. Here is a view of the original Greensward plan of 1857-58.
Now, what jumps out at you?
Well, for one thing, the commissioners, when they let out the competition, one of the stipulations was that the designers had to figure out how to deal with crosstown traffic. Olmsted and Vaux came up with a brilliant idea, and that was to create 4 crosstown transversal roads that they would sink 8 feet below the surface of the park, which meant those enjoying the park would never get interference from all of that crosstown commercial traffic. This would allow for these almost infinite vistas. You wouldn't have a crosstown highway every 20 blocks. And by the way, that's the origin of the name Greensward, which is the name of this plan. Greensward, basically greens, meadows that could go into infinity.
All right, so they win the competition.
Well, and you know one of the other reasons they won the competition, this is a leaf from their entry, from the Greensward plan.
They did a big presentation.
Yes, a beautiful presentation. Look how visually savvy these guys were, especially Calvert Vaux. Look at this. In an instant, you can understand visually what these men wanted. At the very top is a map that Vaux drew up, and it shows you not only the whole plan, but exactly where this vista is. In the midsection is a photograph, and photography was a brand new invention.
Look how dreary and desolate that looks.
That's what the area looked like.
Compared to what's down here.
Well, this is Vaux's landscape drawing of what that same vista is going to look like. No wonder the commissioners fell in love with this plan. It was a brilliant idea.
We're in the southeast corner of the park at 59th Street and 5th Avenue in the shadow of the Plaza Hotel, but if you didn't look up and see it and you couldn't hear the traffic, you would never know you're in New York City. This is now being completely restored.
Isn't this pond an incredible piece of work? And you know, it is a piece of work. Everybody thinks this is some rural pond they built a fence around to keep the developers out. Absolutely not. This is a perfect way to start looking at the collaboration of these two brilliant but individually talented men.
So it was designed, engineered, built from
what was here before?
Yeah.
Marshland, scrubland. I mean, here we have Olmsted giving us the landscape. And what he does is he comes in, takes what he found, this scrubland, and he literally reconfigures it to create this rustic pond. Here's a beautiful aerial shot of what it's going to look like when they rebuild it again.
Tell me what you see here.
First, I see what Olmsted gave us, which was the landscape. This is all designed and built by him and Vaux. He gave it an irregular shoreline, so it makes it look more naturalistic, with even a wooded promontory jutting out into the pond to make it look more like the country. By the way, that promontory is now a bird sanctuary. It's the Hallett Nature Sanctuary. Olmsted then surrounds the pond with a cloak of trees.
But he sank it, too. I mean,
That's what's brilliant about it. The entire scenario is sunk a whole level below the city, and that's why it's so removed, even though 5th and 59th is only a few minutes away. And this is what's fascinating. In order to build this park, they had to lay underneath this entire scenario a high-tech system of drainage pipes. That system extends the entire length and breadth of Central Park. From 59th Street to 110th, from 5th Avenue to Central Park West, there is a substructure of drainage pipes. Now, we're looking actually at the drainage system planned by Ville. You see what most people think are branches of trees? Actually, these are all drainage pipes running through the Central Park site. George Waring Jr. was hired by Olmsted to be his drainage engineer. Waring took over Ville's plan, and he adapted it to the Olmsted and Vaux design of the park. And actually, it's Waring's built drainage system that still allows us to have above ground the fantasy, the idyllic landscape that we see today.
All right, now this is being restored now. It's being bulldozed and drained, and the plants are being replaced. As you can see, it really looks probably closer to what it was originally, but with $4 million of private money, this is now being completely restored.
Well, there's the key, David, private money. You know, about 20-odd years ago, in the 1970s, when you came into this park, oh, it was a mess.
We both remember that.
Back then, one person understood that with our tax structure in this country, we will never have the sufficient funds to really care for these great urban amenities, these great parks.
Either private money or it's not going to be done.
That's right. And that person's name was Elizabeth Barlow Rogers. In 1980, she founded the Central Park Conservancy as a vehicle for bringing private money into Central Park. In these last 20-odd years, the Conservancy has, bit by bit, brought back the glory of Central Park. You know, it's interesting, when Central Park was built in the 1850s, it became a prototype across the country for great city parks. Once more in the late 20th century, Central Park has become a prototype, this time for saving and restoring these great city parks. You know, I really feel that today Central Park looks the closest to Olmsted and Vaux's vision than it has in generations. You know, as the Conservancy reconstructs and rebuilds and restores Central Park, it gives us a chance to be astounded by the vision of these two brilliant men.
It is so peaceful and so quiet right where we are, and we're only a few hundred yards from Columbus Circle. And this is so cool, Barry. Here we are on a pedestrian bridge. Underneath it is the bridle path, so they intersect. Right over here, another bridge, and there's another, pathway for pedestrians. And the bridge is for cars and for carriages. And they wove these three together, and you never run into anybody.
The way that Olmsted and Vaux handled traffic in Central Park, it has earned them the kudos of historians and critics. They are considered innovators of 20th century traffic planning. Now, people might say, traffic in Central Park? I never think of traffic.
Listen, I've driven and run in this park for nearly 50 years, and I've been unaware of all of this. All I knew was, yeah, you can go run and you're not going to run into anybody. It's just really nice. And you still see all the stuff. That's what they wanted.
That's exactly right.
It worked.
Now, remember, they won the original competition because of their brilliant use of sunken transversals. People walking in the park at one level, crosstown traffic at another. That's so 20th century. Yeah. The board commissioners, the board of Central Park, they were wealthy New Yorkers. And they saw in the Greenswood plan there were only two routes through Central Park, basically a carriage route, obviously for wheeled vehicles, and pedestrian pathways. But the rich, they wanted their privileges, and one of those privileges was horseback riding. Right. There was no decent place in New York to do that. So they asked Olmsted and Vaux to include extensive bridle paths, just like they had in the European cities and the great parks over there. And Olmsted and Vaux complied because it fit in with their vision of the park. So this meant you had three separate pathway systems for carriages, for pedestrians, and for horseback riding.
Right.
And Olmsted and Vaux wanted to make sure they were completely separated. Why? In the rest of the city, we walked around with our heads swiveling. But in the park, they wanted you to walk through, to go through the park stress-free, tranquil, peaceful. Everything New York is not. No. Albert Vaux and Jacob Ray Moule designed around 40 different bridges They really were miniature traffic interchanges.
And they are all different from each other. Right?
Yes, just like the trees and the rocks are different. All of these bridges are different, and they use different materials. Wood, most of the wooden bridges fell apart after a while.
Right.
Brick and stone, like the Gray Shot Arch just on the other side of us, that's out of Manhattan schist and sandstone. This is the Trefoil Arch on the east side of the park, also out of stone.
They look so organic. It's almost like they couldn't do it any other way. But they created this, including the grass and all, right?
Exactly. It's all created by them. As a matter of fact, the abutments of this bridge are hidden behind that landscaping, so it feels like the bridge is coming out of the landscape. And then the other material they used, cast iron.
Now, how new was that? Was that...
Very new. I mean, after all, this was the Industrial Revolution. Most people thought of cast iron as a necessary evil, you know, associated with factory steam, ugliness.
Steam engines.
Jacob Ray Mould took cast iron. We are standing on one of his masterpieces. This is the Pine Bank Arch from 1861. And look how Mould took this heavy, ugly industrial material and he turned it into gossamer threads, silken threads of a spider's web.
And Barry Lewis, you are turning words into a web.
This park brings it out. I mean, you look at these bridges, these cast iron bridges, so delicate and light, they just fade into the landscape. Now, this ability of theirs to handle the traffic in Central Park, it shows you that these men are not just park planners, they're incipient city planners. These fellows showed us how to civilize the American city, how to green the American city. All of their innovations they're famous for, it all began here in our own Central Park.
I've seen all the movie stars in their fancy cars and their limousines. Been high in the Rockies under evergreens.
Tony Bennett is simply one of the handful of truly great singers of his era and ours. He is also a brilliant artist. And Tony, thanks for inviting us up here.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
You didn't arrive at this apartment overlooking the park by mistake, did you?
No, I love New York City so much, and I had an apartment, and it was like being in jail. You know, it was another brick wall in front of my window. And yeah, it really upset me, you know. And so I found this because, you know, David Hockney is a great friend of mine. He said, nature never lets you down. And sure enough, you know, just looking out the window and seeing the four seasons of Central Park, it's very meditative. It calms you down. It makes you study nature.
How did this boy from Queens wind up with this much art in him and this much appreciation in him for what's going on around you?
Well, I lived in Astoria in the projects during the Depression, and there was a wonderful teacher that lived in the projects. His name was James McWeeny, and he saw me painting with charcoal on the street, and he said, I like what you're doing, son. And I said, well, thank you. And he said, well, he said, you know, every Saturday, he said, I go out and watercolor. Would you like to come with me? And I'm, you know, 14 years old. I said, God, sure, I love it, you know. So we went to Rainey Park, which overlooks the great skyscape of Manhattan, and I've been going at it ever since.
Describe this painting for us, would you? How did this come to you? Tell us about this.
It's very special, the fall season. You know, when fall comes, all the beautiful colors, the contrasting colors, and it's a feast. You know, fall is a feast for any painter because of all the incongruous colors and the chaotic beauty that it has. You know, it's just natural. All the colors kind of bang into one another, and it all works. My favorite Sunday in Central Park, I got lucky that day, and it was a Sunday afternoon, very busy. Everybody was out, a beautiful, bright, sunny summer day, and it was, you know, you have to get lucky when you do a painting and hope that it works. And I was very concerned that whether this was going to work or not, and it did. It ended up working out. It's all a matter of editing later on. You know, you just paint every day and not plan like I'm going to paint a picture today. You know, you just study. All you do is study, actually. And every once in a while, something out of that, something wonderful subconsciously comes out, and it's just natural. it's very similar to fishing. You just have to get lucky and get a good one.
We're at the south end of the park, walking on this giant rock schist, yes?
Manhattan bedrock, it's what the skyscrapers are all hooked into.
Okay, and we're overlooking the ice rink and the pond. All right, Vaux and Olmsted. As we look out over this, they designed it, they engineered it, they created it. None of this was here except the rock. So who were these guys and what did they have in mind? What did they do?
Well, let's start with Olmsted, because when I look out at this landscape, the first thing I think of is Frederick Law Olmsted. Fascinating man, comes from a well-to-do Connecticut family. First half of his life, he goes from career to career. He's brilliant at everything, doesn't make money at anything. He just bounces around from one fortuitous opportunity to another. But he was a man who understood landscape. He had always appreciated and noticed it even in his first trips to England before he ever had any idea that he would be part of Central Park.
So he was over there and here, always taking all this stuff in?
Yes. You know, this whole idea of this landscape comes out of 18th century England. The work of Capability Brown, who Olmsted admired a great deal. Capability Brown invented the English garden. They create an English garden, a country estate for every New Yorker.
Okay, that's Olmsted. Now Vaux, right? Architect.
Yes, Vaux, I think from the age of 8, he knew what he wanted. He had that vision. He was from the generation of the 1840s and 50s in England. He's English born and English trained. This is the first modern generation of architects and designers. And they really change the whole direction of Western architecture.
How? What to what?
Well, for the previous 400 years since the Renaissance, Western architecture is all about the building. The building is it. The landscape, that's secondary. But beginning with Vaux's generation, they reversed that. And very much like the ideals of the East Asians, Vaux's generation believed that the building should fit into the landscape, be part of the landscape. And you see that beautifully, by the way. If you look at the dairy, which is right in back of us, it's all built of Manhattan schist and sandstone, built in 1870, part of the original plan of the park. Very simply done. But it all began here in Central Park, and I can't think of a better complementary partnership than that of Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. Now,
what's this?
this photograph I have in my hand, you see this photograph in every book on Central Park. It's wonderful. It was taken in 1862, a year after the Willowdale Arch was completed, and it really shows us everybody, or almost everybody, involved in this story.
Now, this is the view we saw as we walked through this arch.
Yes, that's right. It's the exact same direction we came in. The mall's in back of us. The Dean is in front of us.
Now, what's a dean?
Dean, that's an Old English term for a valley.
Spell it.
D-E-N-E.
Okay.
Now, on top of the arch, this is the team that created Central Park. Left to right, Andrew Haswell Green. I can tell it's him. Big man, big personality, held the purse strings. Lots of conflict between him and Olmsted and Vaux. You know, he was a brilliant man, and in fact, he was one of the creators of the modern city. He was in on the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Natural History, the building of Central Park, the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and the creation of the five-borough city. To the right of Green, that's George Waring Jr., drainage engineer. To the right of him, Calvert Vaux. I know it's Vaux because he's short. He was just over 5 feet. To the right, well, I understand. To the right of Vaux, Ignaz Pilat. He was an Austrian-born and trained horticulturist. Oh, brilliant man. He was Olmsted's right-hand man when it comes to choosing the landscape itself. To the right of Pilat, oh, the debonair. Mr. Mould, Jacob Ray Mould. He was Calvert Vaux's architectural assistant. Quite a bohemian. Oh, quite a wild
Piece
liver.
of work.
But brilliant architectural designer. We'll see that when we get to Bethesda Terrace. To the right of Mould, Frederick Law Olmsted himself. Together, they were able to construct the idyllic landscape that Olmsted and Vaux dreamed up.
Barry, this wide promenade, quarter-mile long, under a canopy of elms the whole way. I mean, it almost seems like Vaux and Olmsted said, we want you to come in to the park down there at 59th Street, walk in here, and guess what? This is what this park is about.
It would lead us directly to where they wanted us to go, which was the main social center of the park, Bethesda Terrace. And as a matter of fact, you notice the elm trees. I mean, this is the third planting, but Ignace Pilat, who planted the original elm trees, he created a French alley, a formal alley. So they march up straight like soldiers. They take our eye directly up the mall towards the Ramble and beyond.
Yeah.
Now look at this. Here's the original Greenswood plan. Now, here's the southern end of the park.
Yeah.
When you entered the park and you came up to the mall was meant to bring you directly to the major topographical feature of the park,
Vista Rock.
Vista Rock. Vista Rock was like a little Mount Everest. Huge rock outcropping. Now, you know, within 10 years of this park being built, the trees of the Ramble had grown so tall you could not see Vista Rock. So what did they do?
Let's build something
That's
on
right.
top.
They built the Belvedere. And that's 1867 to 72. And the tower of the Belvedere was meant to rise up above the trees as Vista Rock had. You know, a lot of people think this mall is laid out to be due north. That has nothing to do with it, and it's not due north. Due north is over in that direction. It was laid out. There's your sight line. It was laid out to take you to Vista Rock and to the heart of the park, the terrace, the lake, the Ramble. Now, when they actually built the park, they decided at the north end of the mall they would put the Concert Grove. This is Jacob Ray Mould's 1864 cast iron bandstand, a brilliant piece of work.
Look at now some of this looks kind of Eastern to me, or Near Eastern. I
Sure.
wonder.
Moorish arches, definitely. You know, he was a modernist from England. He certainly picked up these ideas from the modernism in England. He put together Moorish elements, Arabic elements, with medieval European Gothic elements, the kind of thing that cast iron is perfectly suitable for. When this bandstand opened in the 1860s, it was only concerts on Saturdays.
Oh.
Hey, working people were working on Saturday. They had a 6-day week. Well, there was a lot of pressure from labor unions, from politicians who were populists. They wanted Sunday concerts. Against them, the wealthy elite, and, by the way, the Puritans. But in 1884, the people won out. Sunday concerts began. The hoi polloi of New York came up from the city, up the mall, up to the Concert Grove and to the Bethesda Terrace. All of New York would be coming to Central Park. So we have come down the mall, we've passed the bandstand, and now we're arriving at the culmination of that axis, the central focus of Central Park, Bethesda Terrace. Everybody was meant to arrive here, and you know, we were a city that was all speculative development. We had no central great square, so Vaux gave us our own Venetian Piazza San Marco. But it's not a European square, it's an American square. Instead of being confined by buildings, it opens up to this bucolic landscape.
I keep thinking about the photograph of this area, and there was nothing here, or swamp and
It shows
a
you
little
the
bit of dirt.
genius of the team that Olmsted put together.
And this looks totally natural.
Well, you know, Vaux not only gave us this piazza, this is not a single-level piazza like you get in Europe. This is a multi-deck, three-dimensional piazza. It's a brilliant piece of work, which meant you have grand stairs cascading down, you have elliptical pathways cascading down the slopes, you have pathways coming in from the lakes, you have people coming in from the mall and through the arcade. Everybody is coming to the focal point of the park. They're coming here to do what Victorians love to do.
What do they love to do?
They love to gather, parade, and perch.
Can I quote you?
Yes, but that's
Gather,
what they love to
parade,
do.
and
This
perch.
was the perfect place for it. You had many different balconies and positions you could take. And then the background for all of this was Jacob Ray Mould's brilliant decoration. There is the man himself.
He really was a character, wasn't
Yeah. Oh, quite a bohemian, but he always showed up at 9 in the morning to do his work, and he did a brilliant job. All of this decoration is his. By the way, almost none of it repeats itself. It's all individualistic. Mould, by the way, was one of those young modern architects like Vaux, who were pulling beyond the neoclassical system. They're going back to medieval Europe. They're going beyond Europe to the Arabic Middle East, to East Asia. And they're pulling in all these multicultural
And mix them all
sources.
up?
Yeah, and that's what we see around us. I mean, we're seeing some of these three-dimensional panels that he created. You know, they actually do have a theme. On the east side of Bethesda Terrace, everything has to do with the daytime, the sun coming up, the morning. On the west side of Bethesda Terrace, everything has to do with the sundown, the nighttime. And then, David, can you hold this? This is a stonecutter's, it's actually a copy of a stonecutter's drawing that Moule did back when he was creating the park. Now, look on the right. You can see his signature, Jacob Ray Moule, architect. On the left, approved, Sieving.
Calvert Bar.
Oh, yeah.
Now, did the stonecutter absolutely duplicate this or cut it to the same size and all of that? Or?
He would have duplicated the detail, but the size was up to him. He had to fit it into the space that was allowed, and his ability to either jack it up or down in scale, that was his skill.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? So, as we move around Bethesda Terrace, we are surrounded by Vaux and Moule's genius. But the focal point of this terrace, and it's such a brilliant focal point, is Vaux and Moule's fountain, Bethesda Fountain, topped by a statue that I think captures the spirit of this park, the Angel of the Waters.
We're joined by Sarah Cedar Miller. She is the Central Park Conservancy historian and photographer, and she is a walking encyclopedia about this place. Sarah, it's nice to have you with us.
Hi, Sarah.
Nice to be here.
Tell us what we're looking at.
We're looking at the Angel of the Waters Fountain by Emma Stebbins. The angel is from the New Testament, and the angel came down and troubled the waters in the New Testament. Whoever touched the waters was healed. And on opening day of the fountain in 1873, the artist, Emma Stebbins, passed out a brochure. I don't think she was here in person, but she announced that the waters, the healing waters, were dedicated to the healing waters of the Croton Reservoir that were actually healing the people of New York City.
And the Croton Reservoir was basically just beyond the Ramble.
Absolutely. And in fact, the angel originally in all the drawings faced the other way.
You mentioned Emma Stebbins. How did she get this commission, this job?
Well, Emma did have connections. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
And her brother Henry was the park commissioner at the time, Henry Stebbins.
That was enough right there.
Yeah, that's it. And there was no competition. And luckily, she did a great job.
How unusual is it then for a woman to get this quality commission?
Oh, it was unprecedented. Emma Stebbins is the first woman to do a sculpture commissioned in New York City.
Barry Olmsted Vaux did these elaborate, creative plans for this massive area, but they had to physically begin somewhere to actually build the park.
That's right.
Where'd they start?
They were very, very shrewd. The first things they built was the lake and the Ramble, because they wanted to build the elements of the park that would be the most interesting to the public and draw them into the park, and were they right? Now, they won. Remember when we were on top of the Arsenal? We saw the Greenswood plan?
Yeah, and they won the competition.
That was the spring of 1858. By December of 1858, this lake was completed and people were ice skating on it.
Just a few months after
That's
they won
right.
the competition.
And it started such a craze. What was so phenomenal about ice skating? I would say it was the first great modern sports craze. And it pulled in exactly the numbers of people Olmsted and Vaux wanted. You know, on a given day in the 1860s, there could be 30,000 people here. Often there were even 75 to 100,000 people between those ice skating and the spectators. By the way, because this lake is artificial, they could drop the water level to 4 feet and make sure it froze solidly. Now, another thing about this ice skating, fascinating, it was one of the first sports middle-class women could participate in, and it was invigorating. They could do it without a chaperone, and they could show their ankles. Now, you know, people don't realize that sports played a great role in opening up women's lives. By the 1880s, they're playing lawn tennis. By the 1890s, they're bicycling, and it all took place in Central Park. You see, Olmsted saw this lake, the Ramble. He saw all of his park in two lights. One, you could appreciate it passively. You could enjoy the lake for the beauty, the calm, the serenity. But you could also enjoy it actively. Ice skating in the winter, and in the summer, boating.
Yeah.
Well, boating was so popular.
Now, where was this?
This
The
is a
boat?
print of the first boathouse. This is Vaux's work, of course. It was located on the south side of the lake, so when you stood at Bethesda Terrace, you wouldn't see this. And nothing nothing would mar the rustic calm of this vista.
Yes.
Oh, they were so
Look at
so
the different kinds of
interesting.
boats.
Well, you know, back then they had all different kind of boats you could rent, including gondolas with Venetian gondoliers, although I think they probably were Yankee, if not Irish. It was 1858. So it really was quite phenomenal. And then in 1859, 1860, they built Bow Bridge, which we're on.
Most of the time, they seem to use natural materials to build these bridges, but once in a while, not.
Well, we were on the Pine Bank Arch before.
Right.
That was cast iron. This is cast iron. Remember, cast iron was this high-tech material, like a space material would be today. And they did a brilliant job of designing this bridge. In fact, instantly, it became a landmark of the city. And today, with the Central Park West skyline in back, this bridge is one of the most photographed elements in New York. Their design was the perfect segue from the formality of the terrace to the isolation of the rustic ramble.
This feels like we're in a jungle in Borneo.
Well, that was almost the idea.
Really?
Could you believe this is New York City? That's what Olmsted
Right.
and Vaux wanted you to think.
But they call it the ramble. Why the
Because they
ramble?
wanted you to take your time and ramble through. This is what Olmsted wanted to be the most rustic part of the park. In fact, the mall, Bethesda Terrace, what are they doing? They're pointing in the direction of the ramble. They're bringing us poor city folk from the city down below into this rustic wonderland, and this is so typical of the phenomenal genius of Olmsted and Vaux and the team that helped them. In these photographs, you see what this area looked like before.
But again, it's another creation.
That's right. It is all a creation. This is really a stage set. If you want to know the truth.
This is it.
This is the land as he found it in 1858. And this will become, you see this depression? This is going to become the lake. And this rise is going to become the ramble. And now, the finished product. Look at that, almost from the same angle. All of this was meant to be not some natural forest in Upper Manhattan, but truly an idyllic version of a forest. And everything in this ramble, the Gill, this beautiful brook that's running underneath us, actually,
It's a real brook.
no, it isn't. Totally artificial. You can turn it on
I
and
knew
off
that.
like with a faucet. That's
I mean, they
exactly
really
what
can
it
turn
is.
it on, turn it off.
Then Vaux came in, put in these beautiful rustic bridges that are so camouflaged they feel part of the landscape. There's a beautiful rustic stone arch. Oh, phenomenal. One of the 4 rustic stone arches in the park. Now, over the years, this became, it evolved into a natural forest instead of a naturalistic, idyllic landscape.
Yeah, and that's what it looks like now.
And I'm
You
sure-
literally cannot believe you're in New York City.
I'm sure that is why today it is far more attractive to the birds in their migrations than it was when they first built it.
And speaking of birds, Sarah Elliott, she knows birds,
She does.
which is why a good thing because she is standing to your left right at this moment. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you.
Tell us first about birds and Central Park.
Well, we get a lot of birds here, and the numbers keep going up. I'm sure it's because they are on a flyway that leads them right up from southern states, and in some cases Central and a little bit of South America. They come right up the coast. They see this city. It is a sea of cement, and there is one huge rectangle of green. Now, if you're a bird, where would you land? And starting in April, we have increasing numbers all the time, so that by May, it is like the subway. It's just full of birds here. I'm looking at a dead tree. It's in blue sky. Come down to the fork where it's in greenery, and the bird is preening itself right there.
Sarah, how much interest is there in coming to people like you to learn about the park?
Enormous amount. The number of people who now lead bird classes and walks in here has mushroomed. In the beginning, there was one wonderful old lady, and she did them all. Now there are at least 8 or 10 people doing this. Oh, you hear that? Da-da-da, 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 da-da-da. That's a red-eyed vireo singing to us.
What kind of people come out and watch birds?
All kinds. Some of them come and have meaningful monologues with themselves as they walk along, right? Some are big business folk, and they come in early, and they're wearing their suits, and they go from here to the office. Many people come in with a great stone face, and they say, all right, just try to wow me. I'm a sophisticated New Yorker. You can't do that. And those are the people that pretty soon they're just, oh, wow. Oh, did you see that? Wow, I don't believe that bird. See? So then they become like kids. They're that excited.
We hear a lot about red-tailed hawks in New York City. I mean, who would think?
Red tails are becoming like robins. They're making do with cities, because if you don't have enough country, you make do with the city. We have a pair that came in. They were both quite young. They were over at the Great Lawn and made a very poor nest. Then they were down at the Mother Goose statue, and they made another nest and were being harassed by crows.
Where's the nest now?
It's on Fifth Avenue, and there is a large window in the center, and it has lots of scroll work on the top. And the birds came along and said, oh, hey, we could put greenery here, and it'll hold. And this year they were putting in new layers just before the young fledged. They have 3, and for the first time this year, they began all of them on buildings and not in trees in the park.
Sarah, you said you'd been here since 1960 looking at birds in the park. What does this park come to mean to you?
A huge part of my life, a creative part of my life, a learning part of my life. I never can come in here and not learn something new. No matter how worried I am about something or depressed I am about something, I can come in here and it lifts my spirits. There is no way I can go out of here feeling worse because it's so thrilling.
Neil Calvanese is in charge of all the plants in Central Park. He's the chief horticulturalist, and that is a lot of plants.
That's a lot of plants for sure.
But tell us what's
Yeah,
here.
we have a grove of American elms, and you could see the branches, how they arch out, and they're, pendulous on the outside. Just beautiful, beautiful tree. The elm is really under threat all over its range. Dutch elm disease has devastated stands throughout the United States. It was once the most popular street tree. They planted it everywhere. And imported Dutch elm disease, which came here in the 20s or possibly the early 30s on crates of wood, possibly shipping crates, with the European elm bark beetle, they formed a perfect association to kill elm trees. But here in the park, we're somewhat of an island, and we're isolated from surrounding green spaces. And we also have a very aggressive program for looking for the disease, searching it out, and treating it appropriately.
So you're being successful with it?
Very much. We'll lose 10 elms in a year, and I think we have 1,800 American elms total. So you're less than 1% there, and I think that's a good thing. So we're very concerned about our American elm because it is really one of the few places you could come to and see such a magnificent collection. Any season, I think if you go to Literary Walk now, you benefit from the shade of the elm. It's literally 10 degrees cooler under those trees than out on Sheep Meadow in the blazing sun. And if you go there in the fall, golden yellow. Golden yellow with the branches that are outlined against that golden yellow in the back, and you could see their form. Or in spring when they're lime green, just leafing out. They're just a magnificent tree. I think it's one of the most important trees in the park. I love that tree.
Boat pond now, but what was it originally?
Now we're in one of the 2 formal elements in the original Greenswood plan. The first formal element was the mall, which we've seen. This was supposed to be the conservatory area with the formal gardens. This is a section of the Greenswood plan of 1858, and these are the formal gardens that were meant to be here. It never happened because of budgetary constraints. So by the 1870s, they came up with a second plan. This is the pond we know today. They called it the Conservatory Waters because it was meant to be where the conservatory would go.
Is it still called that?
Yes, it is officially, but
no, who knows?
no,
Yeah.
it's the model boat pond. And you know, that's what they meant this to be back in the 1870s.
Huh.
Yes, absolutely. In the 1950s, during Robert Moses' era, he redid part of the area. He brought in two wonderful sculpture groupings. One of these statues was George Lober's Hans Christian Andersen, right over here where they have the storytelling. And then on this side of the pond, this is where he put Jose de Creef's Alice in Wonderland. And as a matter of fact, in that grouping of Alice, the Mad Hatter,
Yes.
his face is a caricature of George Delacorte, the fellow who gave money for that fountain. It's actually a memorial to his wife. And in the same era, the 1950s, Robert Moses also built a new model boat house.
Oh, Lord, look at that. All by itself. Come back here. This place is sanctuary. I mean, nothing gets to me here. Sometimes I come down here 7:30 in the morning, sometimes 2 at night. And I'm here by myself. And whatever I'm worried about my daughter, my finances, it kind of puts me in my place. Because I want to reach that boat so fast, but my arms reach only so far. So there's a lot of humility in it. I say that anybody can buy a 50-foot boat, but it takes a man to build a 50-inch boat.
Did you build it?
Yeah.
How are you controlling it? I mean,
Well, you can control the sails. That lets the sails out. And this is the rudder, which would be the same on a big boat. That's all you have on a big boat.
Sure. How long have you had this boat?
This boat I've had for about, this is the third boat I built. My wife threw me out, so I figured if I'm gonna be crazy, I might as well learn something. So I used to cry, work on the boat, cry a little bit, then work on the boat. So rather than going to the shrink.
This is a healing boat.
Yes. All of them are. In the middle of Manhattan, you're sailing. It's really mind-blowing.
In the shadow of the red-tailed hawks.
Can you beat this? But it's something to see.
We hear Olmsted, but this is Vox.
Vaux and Moule. And why called Belvedere? Because of this beautiful view. Now, when this was built, it would have overlooked the original Croton Reservoir from 1836 to 42 that was built for our very first modern water system.
Right.
That reservoir stretched from right below us all the way up to where the new reservoir is, well, the new reservoir of 1857. By 1917, with new water tunnel construction, it wasn't needed anymore. And in its place, Turtle Pond, it's a beautiful naturalistic pond.
Yeah.
The Great Lawn, and certainly a cultural institution, I think that is so important to all of us. We've had so many wonderful memories of this.
At the Delacorte Theater.
Delacorte Theater, sitting like everything else we are looking at, sitting on the site of that original reservoir.
You cannot talk about theater in the city of New York without thinking about Joseph Papp. The Joseph Papp Public Theater, New York Summer Shakespeare Festival, is just one of the significant, wonderful theater experiences in America. And the leader of all of it, the producer, is George Wolfe, who is also director and writer. And George, it's really a pleasure to be with you.
Glad to be
How
here.
exciting is it to be the guy who is in charge, essentially, in guiding this entire theater?
Well, it's really an extraordinary joy and responsibility. At 8 o'clock every night during the summer, New Yorkers come here, and they are the most generous audience, partly because it's free, but also they're coming to hear Shakespeare and hear the most glorious language. So you have the lake back here, you have brilliant actors performing, and you have this exquisite language, and it's a joyful the thing to be a part of. I know, but when I direct here, it's hell to work here because there's like sun pouring down and raccoons running all over the place. But then at night, at 8 o'clock, it's astoundingly magical and joyful.
How did all this get started?
Well, back in 1954, Joseph Papp started a theater company in the basement of a church on the Lower East Side, and he got together all kinds of actors. And one of the things that was extraordinary about him, I'm sure having to do with his upbringing, because English was his second language, so that therefore he felt a ferocious energy of that everybody should be a part of the American dynamic. So he assembled very a diverse group of actors, which really wasn't happening anywhere else in the American theater. So you had George C. Scott, you had Colleen Dewhurst, you had James Earl Jones, you had Gloria Foster. This vast group of actors inviting them in to play roles, to play the great roles where those options were not available to them. And then they started performing around the city. And there's a big legend. At one point, the flatbed truck was driving through the Delacorte, and it broke down on this site. And he said, "I'll build a theater here." Whether that's true or not, but he wanted to build a theater in Central Park, and he got into this huge battle with Robert Moses, who said it could only be here if he charged. And he said Shakespeare should be free for everyone. So this long, very famous battle went on between the two of them, and Joe prevailed in the end. And so in 1962, the first performance of the Delacorte was Merchant of Venice with George C. Scott.
How significant is it that this theater happens to be sitting almost flat dead center in Central Park in the middle of New York City?
Well, I mean, another component of Joe is that Joe had this incredible sense of civic responsibility. And Central Park is this great wonder. I sometimes believe that the entire New York would go mad if Central Park wasn't here. I think it's one of the great civilizers in New York City, that you can come in this beautiful environment, that you got the most extraordinary skyline and a proscenium that was built by God, and it's just, it enhances the plays. And also, most of Shakespeare's plays were performed outside, so it's back the way it should be.
Joe Morton is simply one of the best actors in America in every venue, whether it's theater, motion pictures, television. Joe, it is a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. You too.
And tell us about Delacorte. Tell us about the Shakespeare Festival. Tell us about public theater and what it is for you, who are very commercially successful,
right,
to also work in this kind of theater. What is it?
Well, first of all, working outdoors is one of the best things in the world. I've worked in a couple of outdoor theaters, one here and one in Lenox, Massachusetts, and when it's 8 o'clock at night and the lights come on and the moon comes up, it's like magic. I mean, you're in magic land. The audience is completely on your side, because even if it rains, it's interesting, we sort of partially got rained out one night, and we sort of waited till it stopped, and as it stopped, the audience started applauding, waiting for us to come back. So working here at the public outside, it's really gorgeous. You can't see from here, but there's a lake behind us, and the lake has 3 beautiful white egrets in it. So that sort of happens at night. They start flying around. There is a play area back here for the crew and the cast in between things where we would go and play basketball. And one afternoon I went out there, and there was a turtle laying eggs in the back of the theater. I mean, so you've got all of nature. You have exactly what Shakespeare sort of wanted us to have. You have all of nature, and then you have your public all at the same time. The other thing, though, I think, is being outdoors in Shakespeare, it takes all the mustiness off of it. Then people don't feel like they're in a museum. Suddenly they're outside, and it's alive, and it's exciting, and anything can happen. One night, one of the egrets just sort of flew on cue. Someone had said something, whatever it was, and it just sort of flew on cue and landed for a second and then took off. And you know, you couldn't design anything like that.
Well, it's really a recreation of the Globe Theater.
Absolutely.
Where everything happens.
Absolutely. We don't have groundlings who are continually talking back at us, which would be nice.
Or throwing tomatoes at
or whatever.
The bad guy.
Right,
yeah.
or whatever. And the clowns don't get a chance to sort of go on and on and on as they might have in Shakespeare's day. But it's very similar in that you do have a live audience that will respond to all kinds of things. It's gorgeous.
Want to know more about Central Park? Log on to 13's website at www.13.org.